Well, I hope each of you is doing well this morning. I sure appreciate you being here and appreciate those who watch us live every Sunday morning and then watch us later in the week in some cases. And I hope that you are blessed by being here and singing these songs, and hope you're blessed by our prayers, and I hope you are blessed by what we say at this moment in our time together. Yes, we are still in the book of Joshua. We'll not be there a very long time like we have in some series. And you may be wondering about the book of Joshua because doesn't it seem to be just one battle after another? And you may be thinking, well, there are all these battles, and you may be thinking that God even seems a bit harsh and severe. And yet you have to remember as you look at the book of Joshua that centuries before, God had spoken to Abraham and he had made a promise to Abraham. And he said, Abraham, I will give you this particular land wherein your descendants can live. And that's why we call it the promised land. It was promised to Abraham, and now hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years have passed. And now they get to go into the land under the leadership of Joshua. It's going to be all theirs. But there are other people inhabiting that, and God has said, I don't want you to mingle with those people and be with these people. You are my chosen people. And so God is being protective, and God is being faithful to those whom he has chosen in the Old Testament. And we can remember that today, in the New Testament time, we are also, even more so, God's chosen people through Jesus. And we can remember that he will keep his promises, and that he cares about us. And so that's kind of the reason the book of Joshua is in the Old Testament for our learning. But still, it's a story of battles. And before we get into this battle in chapters 8, 9, and 10, long battle. Before we get there, as I sometimes do, I want to begin with a question. And the question is, how do you feel about keeping your promises? Well, I know the answer to that. All of you think we ought to keep our promises. But what if you make an agreement with someone, you make a promise with someone, and what if you find out they're not exactly truthful in their side of the deal? Should you keep your promise then? And what if you find out that even as you've made this promise, it's probably not what God really wanted you to do? Should you keep your promise? And those are loaded questions, and those are really hard questions. And everybody's going to have to decide for themselves how it fits into your life and into your specific situation. But that's what this story kind of revolves around. Chapter 9 is the return to Ai. Anybody remember last week? It's hard to remember last week, isn't it? But last week, Joshua had sent 3,000 soldiers up to Ai. It should have been an easy battle, but they find this fierce opposition, and to their dismay, their giant discouragement, 36 of their soldiers die, and the others turn in fear and run. And Joshua's trying to figure out what happens, and God says, Joshua, you've got a sin problem. And the whole chapter is about dealing with the sin problem. And now that's over. And in chapter 8, we are marching to Ai, but this time with 30,000 soldiers, not 3,000. And they easily take Ai by way of Joshua's military strategy and God's gift. And they destroy Ai. They burn the city. Now as you begin to chapter 9, there are several Canaanite kings, and they've heard all the stories about Egypt, and they've heard about Jericho, and they've heard about Ai, and they band together in a military alliance. And they're banding together to say, maybe together we can withstand these Israelites, but they can't. They can't, because God's the one doing the fighting. But there's one Canaanite group in the region of Gibeon. And they have a major city called Gibeon. And we call these people the Gibeonites. And they know there's not a way in this entire world that they can exist in the face of the strength of Israel. And so they decide to approach Joshua to make a treaty with them. Now, hold on a second. Because God has said long ago, even from the mouth of Moses, when Moses thought they would be immediately crossing over, and Moses was not aware at that moment there would be 40 years of wilderness wanderings, God had said, when you go over there, don't associate with those people. Don't marry their daughters. Don't take on their customs. Don't follow their false gods. You are my people. I want you to stay my people. And the Gibeonites decide they'll approach Joshua. And they want to make a treaty. But I want you to read with me how they do it. And it's full of deception. And so if you're looking at chapter 9, you'll start reading in verse 3. And it says, however, when the people of Gideon had heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to a ruse. They resorted to a trick. They resorted to a deception. And so what it says is they went as a delegation. They had their donkeys, and they loaded their donkeys with worn-out wineskins, old wineskins, cracked, mended. They wore worn and patched sandals and old clothes. And the bread that they carried with them was dry, crumbly, moldy. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him, we've come from a great distance, a distant country. Make a treaty with us. Now, I understand why they're doing that. And I don't blame them one moment for doing it. They're looking to save themselves. They're looking to save their families. They're looking to save their children. And if you keep reading the story, you'll find out that Joshua's skeptical, like he should be. And he says, how do I know that you're not from nearby? How do I know that you're not from this land and you're right here nearby? And they'll keep looking at themselves and say, well, just look. Look at these old clothes. Do you know our sandals are brand new when we started this journey? And you know these wineskins were brand new when we started this journey? And our bread was so fresh, it was still warm when we started this journey. We've come from such a far distance, and we've come to be your servants. Make a treaty with us. And Joshua ended up having some of these men sample their bread. Yeah, it was really bad. You look at verse 14. Burke will put that on the screen. They sampled their provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. Didn't ask God about it. And Joshua makes the treaty. And the elders of all the people ratify the treaty. Yes, we will have a treaty of peace with you. But 3 days later, Joshua finds out that he's been tricked. Have you ever entered into a deal where you didn't read the fine print? Have you ever entered into a bargain with someone, or you purchased something you didn't read the fine print? Joshua didn't read the fine print. And 3 days later, he finds out that they're not from a distant country. They're from right over there. And Joshua goes to him, and Joshua says, why did you do this? Why did you trick me? And they're going to say, obviously, the reason why we tricked you was we know about all those stories back in Egypt. And we know about Jericho. And we know about Ai. And therefore, we know about your God. And what else were we supposed to do? And the people of Israel are really angry. Everybody out in the distance, they're really angry. And they don't like the idea that they tricked Joshua. And the people want to destroy the Gibeonites. But Joshua and the elders of the people say, absolutely not. We gave our word before God. We did something with a treaty before God. Now, isn't this interesting? Everybody, have you heard the name Elon Musk? Supposed to be the richest man on the face of the earth. I first started hearing about him when I started hearing about Tesla cars, the all-electric car. And then I began to realize more about him when I heard about the SpaceX program. Because when the United States government decided not to send these spaceships up wherever they send them, he decided he'd do it himself. And then he contracted with the government, and they'd pay him to send things into outer space. And now he has something he's developing called Starlink. And if he gets Starlink where he wants Starlink to be, he will guarantee cell phone service at any place on the face of the earth with no imperfection. Complete. But why you've been hearing about him mostly in the news over the last few months is he made a bargain to buy Twitter. Now, when you enter into these contracts like that, you normally have a time for due diligence in the contract. It's a 90-day due diligence, or it's 100 and maybe 6 months due diligence. And that's where the buyer goes in and begins to examine the books and begins to look at every little detail and begins to see, is this like it was represented? And apparently when he was doing that, he said, Twitter, you didn't represent yourself right. And Twitter said, yes, we did represent ourselves correctly. And so Twitter sued him. And I don't know what happened to all that, but I read last week where he said, I'll go ahead and buy it at the price I agreed. I don't know what happened. So we're back to this question. Back to this question. How do you feel about making your promises and making agreements? And we live in an age where promises are easily broken. Do you know that? We live in an age where we easily find ways out. And there are promises that we make in our marriage. There are promises we make to our friends. There are promises we make to our employers. How do you feel about your promises? And I am not in any way this morning trying to give you a rule about that. I am not in any way saying that there's an absolute about that, because it's something that you have to decide for yourself in your given situation. But it's worth thinking about that when we give our word, God wants us to keep our word. And you say, well, how do I know in this story God wants us to keep the word, His word, our word? Well, you got to look at the last chapter. Because the last chapter, in chapter 10 of this 8, 9, and 10 series is that now the king of Jerusalem is really upset. And he gets another group of people with him, another military alliance. And don't misunderstand the word Jerusalem. This is long before the day of David. And the only way Jerusalem became the capital city of Israel was that David captured it, and David made it his capital city, and it's continued to be that through all these years. But now it's held by an enemy, Canaanite king. And there are several nearby cities. And they say, we'll stand together against the Israelites. But they find out that one of their close neighbors and one that should be in their alliance has already made a treaty. And the Gibeonites have already done this. And here they come against Gibeon. And they're coming with all their might. You know what the Gibeonites do? By the way, the Gibeonites didn't get out of this deal completely free and clear. Joshua had told them, I'll honor my treaty, but you're going to work for us. You said you'd be our servants. You're going to work for us. You're going to cut wood for us for the rest of your time, as long as we exist. And you're going to carry water for us. But it's not a bad deal. You got to work at something, don't you? I'll carry water. I'll cut wood. That's better than the sword. But now they're about to get the sword. And so they send a message to Joshua and say, Joshua, you got to come. We're going to be destroyed. You know what God says? God says, Joshua, you go. And I'll make sure you win the battle. You go and defend them. You made the treaty. We're going to honor the treaty. And they go, and it must be one fierce battle. Because it says that Joshua and his soldiers fight with the sword, and they kill many by the sword. But the enemy begins to scatter, and God will send down balls of ice from the heavens, hailstones from the heavens. And he'll kill more with the hailstones than were killed with the sword. And it must be a long battle. Because that's a famous story in the book of Joshua where it says that the sun stood still for a space of about a half a day. Now, you and I know about the sun, don't we? It's really not moving at all. But from where we stand, it looks like it's standing still. But our earth is rotating, and it makes a revolution every 24 hours. And so we have a morning that comes like we did this morning, and the sun begins to shine, and we have the energy coming from the sun. And as the earth continues to rotate, the sun will disappear, and we'll see stars and the moon unless it's too cloudy tonight. And God just paused that rotation. And I read an article about some scientists one time that said they thought they could pinpoint, they could determine that the earth really did stop turning for a little bit of time a few thousand years ago. But then there are other scientists that say, no, this is impossible. I'm going to tell you, it's another one of those stories where you have to choose to believe. Do you believe the sun appeared to stand still so they have longer time for battle? Well, do you believe the walls of Jericho crumbled? Do you believe that the Jordan River had an instantaneous invisible dam put on it at flood stage and it covered area everywhere that hadn't been covered before? None of it fits the way we think. It's not the point of the lesson. But I'm telling you, I've been saying it more and more and more to more and more groups of people and more individuals. You have to choose to believe. And we choose to believe this story where God is fighting for his people who had made a treaty that they weren't supposed to make. And I probably could tell you some stories about churches that made an agreement and decide that God wasn't the kind of agreement, and they back out of it and hurt some families in doing it. How do you feel about keeping your promises? By the way, there's one promise that you and I make. It's a promise that we made before God when we entered his kingdom. A friend of mine, a lot of years ago, I suspect it's been 25 years ago, wrote a book. And he likened entering into the kingdom to entering into a marriage. And he would go through the stages of the courtship, and he'd go through the marriage process, and he would finally get in the marriage where you said, I do. I promise. Remember how you did that? I promise to love you and to cherish you and to take care of you, whether you're sick or whether you're healthy, or whether you know how it goes, don't you? I promise. And he said, when we get baptized into the kingdom, it's kind of like saying, I do. We're finally saying, all right, I'm in. I'm a new creature. And promises matter. But you've got to decide that for yourself, how you deal with your promises. I want to tell you one thing I know for sure. This is the real point of the lesson. When you are making a decision in this life of any consequence, ask God. Ask God. If you're about to get married, you probably ought to be talking to God quite a bit about it. But even if you're about to buy a car or you're about to do something, you ought to ask God. A friend of mine who's a medical doctor, retired now, he used to tell me this. He said, now, Kim, when I get ready to buy something, I've got a rule. I wait 30 days. If it's significant, I wait 30 days. So all the emotion is gone. And so I have time to pray about it. And then I do what I feel like I should do. So whatever it is, we ought to be asking God, God, which direction should I go? What should I do? And the reason why we ought to do that is because you and I possess inside of us, look at this next slide. And I know I make some of you uneasy. But we have hidden that forever. We have not been willing to talk about that forever. We're afraid we'll take it too far and that I'll become some charismatic person in front of you. That's not what I'm talking about. I just know that when you did enter the kingdom, it says you received the Spirit. And here's what I believe with all my might from my own experiences. When you have prayed and you have asked God about something, and then you feel this little nudge inside, you kind of feel this little leaning inside, go that direction. Because how do you know that's not God through His Spirit saying, this is where I want you to be? And I will tell you, you need to be really, really careful about not following that nudge. If I look back at 19 years as president of Lubbock Christian University, I can tell you 3 times where I made giant mistake. 3 times. And I knew better every single time. Every single time I felt this direction inside of me. I felt this leaning, this urging inside of me to go this direction. But I had all these advisors that kept saying, no, that cannot be right. And I tried to trust the advisors. You would think after once I would have learned. You would think after twice I would have learned. After 3 times, I think I've learned. Am I making you nervous? Everybody okay? We have God living inside of us through His Spirit. There's no doubt about it. And He's real. And He's powerful. And He's there to help us. And He's there to guide us. And He's there to direct us. And I know when we make our promises, we need to be very careful about what we do with them. I know that. All through the Bible it talks about it. But that's not my point. Because I can't tell you what to do with your specific situation every single time. I don't know. All I do know is Joshua made the only mistake you can find in the book of Joshua. You realize that? It's the only thing you'll find in the entire lifespan of Joshua wherein there might be a little hint that he did something poorly. He did not inquire of God. And we need to be a praying people. Not just for people who are sick, and not just prayer of praise, and not just for your own needs, but you need to be praying, God, I have this facing me right here soon. Which way should I go? What do you really want? You know what's best. Do you know that God has already picked out what He wants Corbin to do for the rest of his life? He already knows who it's best for Corbin to marry. And shouldn't we be praying that Corbin will make decisions so that he will realize what God planned for him? Don't you think that makes sense? That God's Spirit will work? Now, Corbin, I don't think you'll get married next week or anything like that, but it's coming. It's coming someday. Okay, everybody understand what I'm saying? And we have that Spirit for one reason. Because Jesus came and died. He came from heaven to save us. And He gave every single one of us a gift that these people in the old day did not have. Do you understand that? He even told his apostles before he was going to leave, he says, don't worry. I'm going back home. I will come again. But in the meantime, there's going to be one I send to you who is your helper, who's your counselor. And listen to this. And he is greater than I. He's greater than I. And so Peter will turn around and say, when you enter the kingdom, you got the gift of the Spirit, just like the apostles had it. Well, I'm not talking about laying on hands and bringing someone back to health. That's not what I'm talking about. If I could do that, I'd go to the nursing home this afternoon. I'd close it down. I'd close the thing down. I'd go from room to room, taking care of everything. It's not what I'm talking about. But because Jesus came, and that's what we're going to remember as we take the Lord's Supper, because he came, I have God's Spirit living inside of me all day, every day for my benefit. Isn't that special?